Please be seated. When I was still a priest, I had a tradition of giving a gift to the confirmands, the people that I'd spent a couple of months with preparing to receive the sacrament of confirmation. And it was easy to pick out a gift for the older people because I could give them a prayer book and suitably embossed with my signature. And I'm sure they treasure it to this day. But the younger people was a harder sort of thing to give because I wanted to give them something that they would care about. And I didn't think they cared about a fake leather prayer book in rich Naugahyde. So one day when I was at the mall, I walked into the Christian bookstore and I found these comic book Bibles. And on a kind of lark, I bought 3 or 4 of them. And I put the child's name in it, signed my name to it, love Father Nick, and gave it to them. And they kind of like, oh, yeah, fine. And months later, I heard from their parents that there were now fights in the minivans between the children over who got to read the comic book Bible when they were driving around. It turned out that they were fascinated by the stories. They weren't learning chapter and verse, but they were hearing the stories of faith. They were hearing the stories of Abraham, the stories of Moses, the stories of Daniel, the stories of David, the stories of Nathan, the stories of Isaiah, of Jesus and of Paul. And they were remembering them so that when they came into church and I started to tell a story, they got it. You know, I kind of want to buy everybody a comic book Bible these days because I think most of us don't really know how the bits of the puzzle pieces of the story fit together. Right? So this is the 7th Sunday in Epiphany in year C. And I look back in my records, and near as I can tell, I've never preached on this. Because we've never gotten this far into Epiphany in year C in the 30 plus years that I have been preaching. So this is all new territory for us. And we've not heard this particular constellation of lessons. But let me just sort of put it into context. You remember the story of Joseph, right? You know the story of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, but do you know the whole of the arc of Joseph's story? Joseph, the child of his father's Jacob's old age, who was beloved of his father, and who received a coat of many colors as a sign of his father's favor. And Joseph, who was also given the gift of dreams, sort of wore that favor comfortably, cheesed off his brothers. I have brothers. I understand how cheesed off they can get. And they were so cheesed off that one day, when they were all out away from home, they decided to kill him. That's pretty cheesed off, but they decided to kill him. And Judah talked him out of it, remember? And then they put him in a pit in the ground to leave him so they wouldn't have to actually kill him. And then some slavers came by and they said, oh, this is even better. We'll sell him into slavery. And he was taken into Egypt as a slave. And because he was a dreamer and because God's favor was upon him, he began to rise through the ranks. He got all the way up to serving as one of the cupbearers, serving the household of one of the cupbearers, Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife betrayed him. And we just heard the beautiful imagery of what it was like for him to be in prison, to have his eyes arrested. But God was with him, and he continued to rise until he rose to being second in command of the entire Egyptian nation. Now, Egypt was a superpower in those days. So they had power and wealth and riches beyond any of the other nations imagining. And Joseph knew there was a famine coming. Remember that part? And so he built store cities, and they stored up food for 7 years. And then the famine came. And Jacob and the 11 sons who were left in Israel began to starve, and they had nowhere to turn. So they decided to roll the dice and go into Egypt to see if they could buy food, because they heard there was food in Egypt. So they went there, and Joseph saw his brothers. And here he was, second in command. He had many men with lots of sharp swords. He could have put all his brothers to death. And there's that wonderful climactic moment when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and the brothers, you can just, no, this is it, revenge. And Joseph weeps and says, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? And he falls on their necks and weeps. And they end up talking through the night. Joseph could have taken revenge. He had every right to take revenge. Eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Lex talionis. It was the law that they were taught, and he chose to be merciful. Because he was merciful, his family lived. Because his family lived, even though they were brought into slavery in Egypt, they became a great nation, so much that Pharaoh was afraid of them. And eventually God led them out into the wilderness, and they became a nation that has taught the rest of the world who God truly is. It's an extraordinary story. None of it would have happened. None of it would have happened if Joseph had not chosen to be merciful. That's a great story. But actually, it's our story. I've been reading a book over February called How to Argue with a Racist. It's a book on the study of genetics, and it talks about how we're all interrelated to each other. And it's fascinating because what we think of as race does not mean anything scientifically. But there's this thing that happens if you start looking at people's genetic lineage. And it turns out that about the year 1500 before the Christian era, everyone who is alive on the face of the earth is our ancestor. Not sort of metaphorically. We are descended directly from everyone who was alive in 1500 BCE. From Aboriginal people in Australia, to people of the Han Dynasty in China, to the emperors in Rome, to Pharaoh, to all the children of Abraham. That is our family. We are all that family. If Joseph had not chosen mercy, we would not be here. We would be different. We would be changed. The present constellation of humanity would not be the same as it is. Joseph's choice of mercy as our common ancestor has allowed us to have the lives we have, for good and for ill. That's what Jesus is talking about in the gospel today. Right? He's in the Sermon on the Plain, which is different than the Sermon on the Mount. And Luke has it tweaked a bit, right? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. He spiritualizes what he says. In Luke's gospel, it's blessed are the poor. You rich? Stinks to be you. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who hunger. Blessed are those who weep at night because they can't pay their bills. They will have what they need, and oh to the rich. And then he goes on and says, but, there's a way out. Be merciful. Give, even to people who you shouldn't be giving to. Turn the other cheek when someone smacks you. Do not give violence for violence. And if you do that, the world will be saved and you will be saved. It's the principles of nonviolence, right there in the Sermon on the Plain, right there in the gospel that Jesus teaches. You hear it throughout Scripture. You hear it in the story of Joseph. You hear it in the teachings of Jesus. You read it in the letters of Paul. Do you know, the Freedom Riders, before they could follow with Lewis and King and all the other great people of nonviolence, if you were going to follow and work in the South for civil rights, you had to pass a test. You had to prove that you had the self-control not to fight back. And when you signed up to work with Dr. King, whatever, they had almost like an initiation, but really a test. Could you deal with the fact that you would be pushed down at the counter and people would dump sodas on your head? Could you deal with people calling you names? Could you deal with being handled roughly? if you could turn the other cheek, if you could love the person who was oppressing you, then you could be a freedom rider. Because Dr. King knew something that Tolstoy had pointed out, something that Gandhi had demonstrated. Dr. King knew that the only way to really argue with people who were racist, people who were oppressors, was not through force, because that would lead to more pain and more suffering. It was through the mirror that you had to hold up to them so they could see their actions in the eyes of another. Pettus Bridge, right? Pettus Bridge, when they walked across the bridge, Old Connor was there with the police dogs and the fire hoses, and they beat them mercilessly. And it was filmed, and it was broadcast on national TV. And it was that moment that held a mirror up to America that allowed Johnson to be able to tweak and push the civil rights legislation through Congress that had been stalled. It was the mirror held up to the world that let us see the poison that was in the oppression that our brothers and sisters were experiencing. And it changed us. Jesus says to turn the other cheek. Jesus says to lend to those who are not going to repay you. Jesus says to go the extra mile, because it is the only way to overcome the violence and the oppression. It is the way. Might does not make right. Right overcomes might. We are on the eve of what looks to be the end of the post-Cold War era. Another land war is about to be fought, it appears, in Europe. We live in a country that is deeply divided. We live in an era when people are struggling to control themselves when they go out to eat or when they get on an airplane. What is our response in this moment? Jesus says to turn the other cheek. Jesus says to love the people who are having the meltdowns, to pay for the groceries of the person whose rage face scared you. Because Jesus says it's the only way to end this. If we fight back, it's just going to get worse. Jesus went to his death. And the story of his death and the story of the deaths of his followers on the crosses of imperial oppression eventually overcame the great empire of the West. Tolstoy, writing his letters in the Tsarist era of Russia, helped overcome the Tsar's excesses. Gandhi, following the teachings of nonviolence, overthrew the British Empire, the greatest empire of the beginning of the 20th century. In our day, if we follow in the way that Jesus lays out before us, picking up our cross and following after him, we too can overwhelm the forces that are arrayed against us. I wish it was not this moment, but here we are. And here we are. Remember the story of Moses. Moses, who was not allowed to go into the promised land, who stood on the bank of the Jordan with his back to the promised land, looking at the children of Abraham, the tribes of Jacob, looking at them. And he says to them in chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, the same thing that we are being told today. Today, I offer you the choice of life and good, or death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I give you this day, by loving the Lord your God, by conforming to God's ways, keeping God's commandments, statutes, and laws, then you will live. And the Lord God will bless you. He goes on. I summon heaven and earth to witness against you this day, against us this day. I offer you the choice of life and death, blessing or curse. Choose life, and your descendants will live. Love the Lord your God, obey God, and hold fast to God. For that is life for you and length of days on the soil, which the Lord swore to give to your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Know our story. Remember our story, because it is the power of that story that can change this moment, and our children can have a different story. Amen.
Amen.